It's time to rewind the clock to the late 1400s, to a moment in English history that still feels like an unsolved case file. Two young princes vanish, a kingdom changes hands, and the truth gets buried under politics, propaganda, and centuries of rumor. This is the mystery of the princes in the Tower. Picture England in April of 1483. King Edward IV is dead, and his heir, Edward V, is only 12 years old. Because the new king is a child, the job of steering the realm falls to his uncle, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, who is appointed Lord Protector. Richard takes Edward to London and places him in the Tower of London. Now, today, the Tower sounds like a threat all by itself. But in that era, the Tower wasn't automatically a dungeon in the public imagination. It was also a royal residence, and it was a normal staging point before a coronation. So at first, the story doesn't have to feel sinister. It can almost sound procedural, like this is what we do before crowning a new king. A few weeks later, Edward's younger brother arrives, 9-year-old Richard, Duke of York. Their mother, Elizabeth Woodville, has been on high alert. After Edward IV's death, Richard of Gloucester moved quickly and arrested members of her family, and she sought sanctuary at Westminster Abbey. Eventually, she agrees to release her younger son. The brothers are reunited in the Tower, and from the outside, it looks like everything is lining up for Edward V's coronation. And then it doesn't happen. The entire story takes a sharp turn in June. A cleric, Ralph Shaw, delivers a sermon claiming that Edward IV's marriage to Elizabeth Woodville was not valid. And if that marriage was invalid, then their children, including the two princes, could be declared illegitimate, which means Edward V's claim to the throne collapses. Within days, that argument gains political traction. Parliament accepts the claim, and Richard of Gloucester no longer presents himself as protector of a young king. He presents himself as the rightful king. On July 6, 1483, Richard is crowned Richard III. Here's the question that haunts everything that follows. If the princes are no longer legitimate heirs, what happens to them? They're still in the Tower, but as the summer moves on, they're seen less and less. At first, there are reports of normal life, glimpses of the boys in the gardens at windows together. But those sightings fade, and by the end of that summer, the princes disappear from public view completely. One of the more chilling details comes from Dominic Mancini, an Italian observer in England around that time. He wrote that the older boy, Edward V, seemed increasingly frightened, and that he appeared to believe something terrible was coming. Whether Mancini's account captures the full truth or just the atmosphere of rumor and fear, it matches the pattern that makes this case so unsettling. After Richard III takes the throne, diplomats and onlookers stop reporting any sight of the princes at all. It's as if the historical record just closes its mouth. During Richard III's reign, whispers spread that the boys were dead. There's even legislation from the period condemning the shedding of infants' blood. It doesn't come right out and name Richard III, but the fact that such language is circulating tells you what people were willing to believe, or at least what they were willing to insinuate. Then, in 1485, Richard III dies at the Battle of Bosworth, and Henry Tudor takes the crown as Henry VII. By the time Henry arrives, the assumption that the princes are gone is already widespread. And yet Henry doesn't do the one thing you might expect a new king to do if he wanted to clear the air. He doesn't launch a public investigation that answers the question. He doesn't produce the princes alive. He doesn't unveil bodies. He doesn't put Richard III on trial. Obviously, Richard is dead, but you could still condemn his inner circle or build an official case. Instead, the uncertainty just lingers. That uncertainty creates space for something else. Pretenders. In 1487, Lambert Simnel appears. Then in 1491, a more famous claimant surfaces, Perkin Warbeck, insisting he is Richard, Duke of York, the younger prince. Warbeck's claim doesn't just stay local gossip, either. He attracts support abroad and keeps the story alive for years before he's finally captured and executed. And that brings us to the version of events many people recognize today. The story shaped by Thomas More in the early 1500s and later amplified by Shakespeare. Moore describes a murder plot in vivid detail, one supposedly set in motion on Richard III's orders. The problem is timing and context. Moore is writing decades after the disappearance, and he's writing under Tudor rule, under the dynasty that benefited from Richard III's downfall. And crucially, the independent documentation for the confession Moore describes doesn't show up elsewhere. But once his narrative takes hold, and once Shakespeare turns it into drama, Richard III becomes a near-permanent villain in the popular imagination. It's a powerful story, and it sticks. Centuries later, the mystery gains a physical artifact. In 1674, workmen at the Tower of London are demolishing a staircase when they find a wooden box containing bones, two child-sized skeletons. King Charles II orders the remains placed in Westminster Abbey, identified as Edward V and Richard, Duke of York. Those bones are examined in 1933. The experts conclude the remains likely belonged to children close to the prince's ages, but the science of the time had limits, and the conclusion wasn't the same thing as certainty. Today, people naturally ask, why not do modern DNA testing? It could potentially confirm whether the bones match the royal line. But further testing has been repeatedly declined by Westminster Abbey and the royal family. So the bones remain where they are, present, famous, and ultimately unverified. So who did it, if anyone did? The simplest answer people reach for is Richard III, because he had custody of the boys and benefited from them being out of the line of succession. But historians who push back on that point out some uncomfortable facts. There's no direct, contemporary proof that Richard ordered a murder. No surviving document says, plainly, here is the plan, here are the men, here is the disposal. And there's another angle. Henry VII benefited enormously from the princes not reappearing. If either boy had lived, Henry's claim would have been shakier. And then there's the Duke of Buckingham, a powerful noble with access and ambition, sometimes suggested as someone who could have acted independently. Other theories exist too, that the boys died of illness or that one, or even both, somehow survived in a Henry VI's reign. The trouble is that these survival theories don't rest on solid evidence. They often rely on gaps in records and the understandable human desire for a twist ending. What we can say with confidence isn't dramatic, but it's the core of the mystery. Two boys entered the tower, and no official account ever tells us what happened after that. And in politics, silence can be its own kind of weapon. It leaves room for stories to be shaped by the winners, and for suspicions to harden into truth just because they've been repeated long enough. The princes in the tower have become more than a historical question. They're a symbol of how power can rewrite a narrative and how a lack of documentation can echo across centuries. Even the discovery of Richard III's remains in 2012, found under a parking lot in Leicester, reignited interest and pushed people back into the archives with fresh eyes. But even with renewed scholarship and modern technology, the central question is still stubbornly unanswered. Will we ever know what happened? Maybe. If the remains in Westminster Abbey are ever tested, we could get closer to certainty about at least one part of the story. But even then, DNA wouldn't tell us how the princes died, who ordered anything, or whether the bones are connected to a crime at all. It would solve one piece and leave us staring at the others. The lasting tragedy here is easy to forget amid all the political intrigue. This is about two children trapped inside a dynastic struggle they didn't create and couldn't control. Whether they were murdered, whether they died quietly, or whether the truth was deliberately hidden, their disappearance became one of history's longest-running cold cases. Thanks for spending this time with me, and for keeping space for the uncertainty as well as the story. If you enjoy these deep dives into history's biggest mysteries, follow or subscribe wherever you listen, and leave a rating if you can. Until next time, take care of yourselves and each other.